Not yet. Okay,
Yep,
there we
you're
go.
good. You're good.
All right. Hi, everyone. We are three spooky middle grade authors here to talk to you about writing scary stories, reading scary stories, why we love scary stories. We're going to start by introducing ourselves and our books. Victoria, would you go first?
Sure. My name is Victoria Piantek, and I am the author of The Spirit of Catskill County, a book about a girl and her best friend who just happens to be a ghost. And her mom dies at the beginning of the book, so it's also her journey to kind of come to terms with her mom not being around anymore. So that's me.
All right, lovely. Thank you. How about you, S.A. Larson?
I completely forgot about my own book. Yeah, this is my book, Motley Education. There's a lot of Norse mythology in it, but it takes place in the real world. And it's about a girl who she's really trying to learn to accept herself. And she has to go on a journey to find a relic to save a spirit world. And it's really about friendship also with her best friend, Fleischman, and how their friendship grows and how they learn to work together. And what about you, Jacqueline?
Well, thanks for asking. I'm Jacqueline West. I have written several spooky middle grade things, including a 5-book series called The Books of Elsewhere, which I always show backward. There we go. The Books of Elsewhere are kind of a dark mystery fantasy about a girl and her mathematician parents who move to a new town and buy this strange old stone house. And Olive, my main character, soon discovers that the house is full of all kinds of magical secrets, including paintings hanging on all the walls that seem to move. Every now and then, out of the corner of her eye, she'll see something in them changing. And eventually she discovers she can climb inside of those pictures and explore. And then her life starts to get very dangerous. So that is The Books of Elsewhere. I also wrote a mystery called Digging Up Danger in cooperation with the Story Pirates. This is a mystery writing guide as well as a spooky story for middle grade readers. And I wrote The Collectors, which is another kind of dark mystery fantasy. This one is about wish magic, about the kind of creatures that we tend to maybe ignore, but that might have more power than we could give them credit for, the kinds of magic that we use and don't really think about. So that's me in a nutshell. So we thought we would start by talking about the scary stories we grew up loving, including, of course, R.L. Stine. This is about R.L. Stine's birthday, and he is such a giant in our field. So did either of you grow up reading R.L. Stine or have kids who loved his books? What other books did you love when you were a young reader that were spooky?
Well, for me, unfortunately, I'm too old, so he didn't have them when I was younger. As far as being when I was younger, I used to sneak. My uncle was a really big Stephen King fan, and being way up here in Maine, you kind of sort of have to be. So I used to sneak into his office, and I remember reading Salem's Lot and Carrie. It was Carrie that did it for me. I think probably because she was such a damaged character. I think that's really what attracted me. It wasn't so much the spookiness at first, but then I learned to appreciate that. But talking about R.L. Stine and my kids, yeah, just a couple. I went into the basement just to dig out a few. I was like, yeah, I remember reading them all. That was one of their favorite series, and then just watching once they all became like, I don't know if they were actually movies or if it was like half-an-hour cartoons. I can't remember, but when they were younger, yeah, we watched a lot of those.
Great. How about you, Victoria?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm in the same boat with Sherry. I didn't actually get to have R.L. Stine when I was growing up, but I definitely, my kids have loved them. I have a little one who is still reading and still obsessed with them, and he loves them. And I think for me, I dabbled into a little Stephen King, but I was also very, very much a Edgar Allan Poe fan. Like I just devoured everything that he wrote, which is kind of stodgy and old, but it just scared me in the best possible way. So yeah, that was kind of me delving into those stories. How about you?
I love that. Oh, I am a giant Poe fan. I discovered him, I think, when I was in about 5th grade, and his creepy poetry just blew my mind. So yes, Poe was a big one. And yeah, I grew up with some R.L. Stine. It was actually my younger brothers who were more into it than I was. I think I too was a little ahead of the curve, but they had the entire series. For me, it was books like the Bunnicula series about the vampire rabbit, which were creepy and funny at the same time. And I loved that combination. And it's the kind of thing I try to do in my own stories. And Mary Downing Hahn, who is just another legend. Like, such good, such spooky stuff. So those were all very influential for me. So I thought next we could talk a little bit about why do we specifically write scary stories? Why don't we write the happy, sparkly, sunshiny ones? What is it about spooky or creepy or dark stuff that draws us as writers and readers? Victoria, you want to start this time?
Sure. For me, I've been thinking about this a lot since you sent the questions, and actually ever since I wrote mine. And I think for me, it's kind of to understand my own fears, because I actually am a huge, huge scaredy cat. Like, I'm afraid of everything. My sister and I always joke, like, we often growing up slept in the same bed together because we were always scared, and we always were thinking there were ghosts. So I also kind of always, and then being drawn to all of the mystery, spooky stuff. But I think it's, for me, it's to understand my own fears. And I sort of love to write those that you think are scary, and then you find out they're just misunderstood, because I think it makes me feel better. That's how I think I feel it.
Absolutely. And you, Sherry?
Well, that's a really good answer, Victoria. I like that. For me, I think part of it is the unexpected and the unknown of spookiness, which ends up making me think and trying to figure things out. And that's part of the reason I think I also like to write them, because I like to try and make, kids think. And also to add to what, or just in agreement with what Victoria mentioned about how it just, things that you thought were scary, and then it ends up slowly, but they unveil themselves that they're actually not as scary as you thought, and that there are ways to understand them, or different points of view to look at them at. So yeah, I'd say that'd be me.
Yeah. I think I'm a combination of both of you. I am also riddled with fears. I have many, and I had even more as a kid that were sometimes just overpowering, because I think when you have an active imagination, that just, it can form your whole life. So I remember being terrified of our basement, terrified of my closet, terrified of the dark under my bed. And yet I loved scary stuff. Like the Count was my favorite character on Sesame Street. I always loved the dark and creepy ever since I was really small. So yeah, I think it's wanting to play with the stuff that frightened me, kind of like how kids get into dinosaurs or sharks. For me, it was scary fiction, and getting to, understand and control those fears and make my characters confront them and be braver and even more resourceful than I am. So, but I wondered about each of you, are there certain fears that you see yourself going back to or using over and over again in your fiction? Maybe phobias or maybe themes that are important to you as a person that you then get to kind of work out as a scary fiction writer? Sherry, you want to start that one?
The first thing that comes to mind when you ask that is, it was something I discovered in one of our chats before COVID happened that I hadn't realized. I actually realized it as I was in one of these virtual chats with some of you. I seem to have a theme with a child having issues with his or her mother, and I didn't realize that. And it came from a lot of fear about being misunderstood or not being accepted, or feeling that you didn't measure up. Those are different kind of fears, than the creepy ones we talk about, the monster in the closet. But that's one that I think it's obviously something from my childhood that just has come out in my characters, and I've been able to explore that in different ways. Like in Motley, Ebony she stands up really, really strong against her mother. Finally, where she really ends up realizing she didn't need to, it was just communicating. And it was actually through fear, and it was from these fire giants that she met and all that kind of stuff. So, I think that would be it.
Yeah, that's great. But it often has this real world kind of deeper meaning than the fear we think we're confronting. Yeah, and Victoria, what about you?
Yeah, I find myself very drawn to ghosts and spooky houses and things that go bump in the night, and like the door slamming when you don't know why it's slamming, or the light popping on. And I do feel like that is very rooted in my childhood. I feel like we grew up I feel like we lived in a bunch of creepy houses, like growing up. And And also, I have parents. I mostly grew up in the South, although I also spent time in Maine, up near Sherry. And I think Maine has this kind of aura too. Like I think both Florida and Maine, being at the far ends of the country, both have this aura for like kind of creepiness with the houses. And but both my parents and my grandparents all told ghost stories as if they were like going to the store. They talk about ghosts all the time. So it wasn't really like if ghosts are real. It was sort of like, oh, my mom always loved to tell a story about after her mom died and how she visited her in a dream. And I'm like, my grandfather was a teacher, and he's like, you don't need to be afraid of ghosts. And so I think probably my family. I hope they're not watching this. Probably scared me to death, and so I'm probably still trying to work out that. What about you, Jacqueline?
Yeah, setting is very frequently where I start with a story. I'm often inspired by specific houses, specific little towns, specific places that I want to imagine the history of, and often that history turns out to be very dark and full of secrets. But yeah, I also get to use all of the many, many things that I'm afraid of. So I see the things that still frighten me frequently popping up in my stories: fear of the dark, there are basements, there are woods at night, there's deep water. And I get to explore all of that. And like I said, make my main character battle it and come out victorious. But my main theme I've noticed in everything that I write, especially middle grade, tends to be about sort of finding your people. Almost all of my main characters start out very isolated for very widely differing reasons, but there's that sort of fear of loneliness, fear that you don't matter, fear that you can't make a difference, that no one would miss you if you weren't there. And then each character slowly discovers, while confronting these other smaller fears, how resourceful they are, or how important or unique they are, or how much they're needed by other people around them. So yeah, I guess that's the big fear that's spreading through them all that then gets to be resolved. So getting into the nitty gritty as writers, I thought, what kind of tips or techniques would you give to young writers who want to write scary fiction? What kind of things in a scary scene or scary story are you paying special attention to make sure that fear is there for the reader? Anything that you tend to do? Victoria, want to start?
Yeah, I think going back to setting, I think setting can really, I think it can really draw out the suspense and, help with kind of that suspenseful thing. I think one of the most important things about writing, and I don't know if y'all will agree, but is to just kind of believe in yourself and don't self-edit. Like it doesn't even matter, if you're writing spooky or whatever you're doing, just kind of let your creativity flow and don't self-censor before you even have a chance to get it on the page. And it will probably be messy and look terrible, and you might be embarrassed, and then you'll set it down and you'll come back 3 weeks later and be like, oh, that wasn't so bad. Or you can shape it back up. But I definitely think setting and to really dig into kind of the visceral emotion. So like any sort of like physical feeling, that like fluttering stomachs or, shivers up your arms, like anything that can kind of bring the physicality to the fear, I think can be really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, Sherry.
Another thing I would probably say is I like to use things like people or objects or whatever, like in ways that a reader wouldn't expect, and we've all heard like wooden puppets that talk, or like plants that get up and walk, or just different things, or like, that one, those kind of things. And then, look at them and what do you see, smell, feel, use all the senses. And then sometimes even the senses, I like to always try and add something that would be a little bit quirky, once again, that's unexpected. Like the manuscript that I'm working on right now, it has some of that. I'm using a woodlot. It's not really a forest, so I would call it a woodlot. But what I'm starting to do finally in the second edit is go through and using it almost as a clue to part of the story. So it gives that creepy element because I can use all kinds of things in the woods or in the forest or whatever. But it reveals something about the character themselves as well. You end up, by the end, you figure this out, about how the character is more isolated at the beginning and afraid of what's he ends up encountering at the beginning. But by the end, so it's almost like the forest is like a metaphor, and then it becomes not as scary by the end. That's, those are some of the things. And just to reiterate what Victoria mentioned about believing in yourself and just sitting down and writing. First of all, first drafts, just keep writing. Because it's amazing once you finish, and you both know, you finish that first draft and then you put it away for a little bit and you go back and there's just new life in it. You just see all the stuff that you didn't see the first time, and you remember that chapter you had such a hard time getting through, and then all of a sudden it's, oh, that was an easy fix. And so, those are things that, and that's something I learned over time, because I remember when I wrote my first manuscript, my young adult novel, is I just wouldn't leave it alone. I just kept going. I think if I would have left it alone, I would have finished it much, much quicker.
That is, such a good point. With my my very first book, The Shadows, which is volume 1 of the books of Elsewhere, I had one of those crises of confidence where several years into writing the book, I just thought, this is worthless. It's too similar to other things that exist. No one's ever going to read this anyway. And I gave up on it for 3 years, wrote other things, and finally came back to that old draft on my computer. And enough time had passed that I could no longer remember writing it. So I could genuinely read it objectively for the first time. And that's when I finally saw, oh, there's stuff here that's worth salvaging. I want to know what's going to happen to these characters. I need to give them an ending. So now that's part of my process, is to try to put away a draft for at least 6 weeks if I have the luxury, sometimes more. I mean, sometimes it's a full year and there'll be dust on the binder when I take it out again. And then I really get to give it that objective look. So yeah, that's a great tip for writers. Give it a little space. And like Victoria and Sherry both said, is taking it back to the body. As a writing book I just read said, whenever you are starting to feel like there's just too much distance between you and the main character, you're not feeling that the tension that a scene like that needs to have, think about going back and putting yourself inside the character's body and what specific things would they be feeling and noticing. Using everything you can, using skin, using hair, standing on end, using the feeling in your stomach. When I do writing workshops with kids, we start with those things, and there are certain phrases that we often use, like butterflies in your stomach or goosebumps rippling over your skin, and try to find ways to word that in a new way. Like, what kind of figurative language could you use to express that feeling in your stomach or that feeling on your skin? That's not what we usually hear or say. Because the more distinctive you can make that, the more true to just your story, the more that's going to resonate then with readers and really make them be able to feel it too on their skin. So yeah, that's a big one I do. And like you both said, trying to use many senses to create that setting. With the collectors, because my main character is hard of hearing, and there are scenes where he's not wearing his hearing aids, which also only sort of partway put him back into the hearing world. He relies strongly on his other senses. So I focused really hard in that book on the visual and the tactile, which was really fun in scenes where he is in complete darkness. So there I didn't even have visual. And I just had to think about, what would he be able to feel with his skin, with tremors in the air, with the ground under his feet. And I hope that some of those scenes are effective for that reason, because to me they are. Like, the idea of being in a place where some of your senses are removed, and then you would have to use what's left to navigate. So that was fun. Can either of you scare yourself while you write? Do you get like the creepy crawly feeling as you're working, or are you in enough control that like you don't usually feel that way? Either one want to jump in?
I always scare myself. Like, that's why I'm doing the right thing. Like, I always scare myself. I mean, not always. But if I do scare myself, I feel like, okay, I'm definitely on the right path here. What about you, Sherry? Do you scare yourself?
Yeah, I know I have a couple different incidents with my book that's coming out next year. It's entitled Dead Alley. It's the second book in multi-education series. There's a lot of crows. That's all I'll just say in it. And I mean, I did some of those weirdest things with crows. I just kept thinking, what would be, odd or whatever. And I'd end up finding myself like either in my backyard or like when my kids were, everybody was out of the house or whatever, and I was here alone. I'm just with the dog, and then like they'd be like, I mean, 3 crows on the front lawn, but it looked like 100 to me. And then I'd start watching them, and I'd get all like, I'd freak myself right out because then I remembered what I was writing. But then, of course, it also inspired me to like tweak this one and tweak that one. And then I also had a scene in my young adult book that this guy, he was in the woods and the girl didn't expect to see him, and he ended up morphing into this very strange, he almost looked like by the time I got done describing him and having him move and interact with her and stuff, he almost was like an actual stick figure. You know, kids draw stick figures, and it actually came out way better than I didn't mean to do that. And then it was just really, I freaked myself out because I was doing it at night, and I would just have, everyone's asleep in the house and it's dark, and I just have my little light on in the office, and I had my office door open just a little bit so the hallway's dark. So then I just keep thinking I hear something or see something in the hallway. I'm like, what am I doing?
That's creepy.
That's really creepy, Sherry.
My little 5-year-old created a character that existed at his school called Mr. Scribble. And it was just this like a stick figure that would lurk always out of the corner of kids' eyes and then leave little scribbles on things. And for some reason, I found that utterly terrifying. But that was not my imagination. That was something about that reminded me of Mr. Scribble.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, someday he can use that. For myself, the funny thing is I can't scare myself as I'm writing. And I think that's part of why I like it. Because like I said, I'm terrified of everything else. But here I'm in enough control that even things that, if someone else were writing about them would definitely frighten me, when I am the one holding the pen, it's less frightening. Then I'm just thinking about, I guess, the craft of it and what my characters would say and do. And so, yeah, I get that feeling of power over the whole situation. But do either of you think about, as you're writing those scary stories, especially the darkest scenes, about relieving that tension? Do you try to go for a balance of, okay, I just had this moment of extreme darkness, now I'm going to do something else? And how do you plan, okay, now I need to move on to a different kind of mood? Do you consciously do that, either of you? Victoria, you want to? Oh, sorry, Sherry, go ahead.
Oh, no, that's fine. Go, Victoria.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I do that very intentionally. Because you kind of want, because that sort of up and down in a novel, I think it's so important to either alleviate it with a little bit of humor, or maybe a sweeter spot of understanding, or a little sweet spot of empathy. The Spirit of Cactual County, because the main character is dealing with the grief of her mom and also trying to figure out how this one ghost can still interact with her, but her mom has gone from her world. I think there are moments where Sparrow really alleviates that kind of sense of scariness with empathy for the ghost and a real heart for the ghost. And then there are other times when there's another kind of sort of very peppy kind of character in there, and then she can bring in the humor. But yeah, I definitely think you kind of have to take it up and down, right? Mm-hmm. Sherry, I guess.
Yeah, there has to be a balance. I totally agree. And for me personally, I just seem to judge that balance with humor. That's just how, and maybe it's also too, in Motley, it's the two characters. Ebony is much more, she's a really strong female character, doesn't really care what people think about her. And her best friend, he's like super bright, he's kind of quiet, and he's pretty much does things by the rules. And he is funny, but he doesn't know he's funny. He's got a really dry humor. So, and that always cracks her up. So in that particular book, I inserted that every so often when I felt that that the tension needed to be broken, but also to move the story forward in some kind of to give a different view of what the story is, because it's not just all about spooky. It's not just all. I think we just all use that as a vehicle to get these stories from one place to another.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think I do the same thing, where it's kind of relying on the characters and a moment of character exploration or dialogue or humor, especially, to move you on to the next thing. In each of my books, well, not in Digging Up Danger, but in the Collectors and Books of Elsewhere, there are talking animal characters, because I write fantasy. And they're all hugely important to the stories. And in each one, they're kind of that comic relief. But they also tend to be the characters that kids love the most. So in the Books of Elsewhere, there are 3 cats who are the kind of guardians of this creepy house. And one of them, whose name is Harvey, basically has multiple personality disorder. Like he's spent so long trapped in this house. Sometimes he thinks he's a pirate. Sometimes he's a knight. Sometimes he's one of the 3 musketeers. And because he's also facing these really dark and dangerous situations along with my protagonist, I think kids then are even more invested. I know I am. Like I care about Harvey because he's so odd and funny, even in the darkest of moments, that I really want him to be okay. So yeah, that I think helps me. Well, we're starting to run low on time, so I thought we could talk quickly about what each of us is working on next or currently, and whether it is dark and spooky or something completely different. Who wants to start?
I can start.
Great.
So mine, it's about fears, but it's definitely in a different vein. It's a much more humorous and set in the real world. My next book that's coming out next summer is called Better with Butter, and it's about a girl who is struggling with some pretty intense anxiety, which, as you were saying, Jacqueline, I think I just feel like that's something when you have kind of an active imagination, like I can come up with fears like nobody's business. I mean, I can, I can make anything scary. So she's struggling with that, and she rescues a miniature fainting goat, and then contrives to take the goat to school as her emotional support animal. So I hope that there's a lot of humor in that one. It's very different, but it is still about fear in many ways.
Mm-hmm. And Sherry, what about you? What are you working on?
Well, my book that comes up next year, like I mentioned, it's entitled Dead Alley, and it takes it could be considered a standalone as well, but it does take a little bit from the first story, and it's based on like a different fear or a different emotion. It's guilt. It's something that happened in the first story that the main character feels responsible for, even though most of it was out of her control. So she explores through the whole journey of how to recognize the differences there and how to learn to balance those through all the action and the spookiness and all the crows. And what I'm working on now, I mean, tentatively, I don't know if this is what will happen once and if it sells. It's called, so far I have it entitled The Mysterious Tree of Dead Things. And it's different for me. There's a lot of spookiness in it, but it's more contemporary. It reminds me a little bit of, how the things that I've read that you've written, Victoria. It's very much more, I think it's a lot sweeter, because I tend to be very action, and you mentioned, Jacqueline, about you write fantasy, and that's pretty much what mine has been. And this isn't really at all. There's still a cemetery involved, because there has to be, but there's a mystery that goes along with the cemetery, and there's a lot of self-exploration in it. It has to do basically with the main character learning to deal with his grandfather's dementia, and so hopefully kids can relate to that.
Yeah, I'm sure. I also love that both of you have animals in a theme in your next thing, although very different animals in very different ways.
I love animals.
Oh, me too. And I've always wanted a pygmy goat specifically, although fainting goats are also adorable. And my next thing it's like my most traditional sort of ghost story I've ever written. My book, it's a middle grade standalone, and it's called Long Lost. And it will come out in May. We'll see what the world looks like by then. I have no idea what kind of launch experience that will be. But yeah, May, I think 21st, and very soon I'll be able to reveal the cover. And I'm very excited about this one. Yeah, it's about stories and sisters and secrets and a strange small town library and a book that may or may not exist. And yeah, it was a strange experience writing something mostly in the world we're in now. I revised this book mostly in lockdown life, and that was a different experience. Yeah, and I'm sure that that's impacted the book in ways I can't even see right now. But I'm excited about having it come out into the real world and find readers. And yeah, I hope if they like spooky, ghosty stories and kind of story within a story, Victorian layered, creepy library stuff, that they'll like Long Lost.
You're both
So-
hitting on everything I love to read. So I will be
Yes.
an early adopter and reader of both your books because you're all hitting on stuff that I'm like, yes, check all my boxes.
Well, glad to hear it. So we should say, if you want to learn more about any of us or our books, you can find us on Spooky Middle Grade. Please check out that site, which has a blog. It has all kinds of information about booking all of us for events. Anything else anyone wants to mention before we say goodbye?
No, just
Nope.
happy,
Just,
happy
yeah,
Halloween because it's coming up.
yeah, it
Yes.
is. Yep.
I know, fall at last. Yes. All right. So thank you so
Alrighty.
much, young readers and writers. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.